So what I'm going to do is tell sort of 3 stories, or maybe it's one story with 3 overlays. And the first story starts with some work I'm doing right now on the opt-out revolution and the changing narratives of motherhood. Now, the opt-out revolution, as many folks will know, is a term that was coined by Lisa Belkin in an article in the New York Times Magazine in October of 2003. And it's a term that was used to describe the decisions of upper-middle class, professionally trained women to leave the workforce, apparently in droves, to stay home and take care of their children. So, trading in their briefcases for a diaper bag. The article caused a remarkable stir. First, the opt-out revolution became the focus of a total media explosion. Every news outlet had to do a story to track this phenomenon where professional women are leaving the market in droves. But it also produced, and this is something I'm a bit more interested in, a stir within feminist circles, with academics denouncing the opt-out revolution narrative from the Belkin article and the various other stories that follow suit. Now, I looked at a bunch of the feminist responses to this, and it basically tracked 3 distinct kind of responses. A first one is a descriptive claim. It's a claim, she's wrong, it's just not happening, and this is primarily feminist economists who dispute the statistics that Belkin relies on. There's a second critique, completely different, normative. It shouldn't be happening. It is, and it shouldn't be happening. Women shouldn't leave the market. And this is a critique that was really led by Linda Hirschman in a very highly controversial article denouncing choice, feminism, and choice, and women really shouldn't make choices. Not the most popular of arguments to make, but whatever. It does get you on Oprah, though, right, when you make that. And she just basically argued that, yes, this is happening and it has to stop. Shouldn't be happening. A third, more analytic critique that goes something like this. Women aren't opting out, they're being pushed out. And this is associated with the work of Joan Williams. Women are being pushed out by a range of factors, workplace inflexibility, workplace bias against mothers, and other sorts of factors. Others within, I think, a similar kind of analytic critique have focused on gendered norms that structure motherhood, gender norms structuring the workplace, yet others that focus on the idea that, well, really this is only a choice for the most privileged. Now, each of these critiques, I think, brings a powerful corrective to a pretty simplistic story that was told by Belkin. But I have a very different story to tell about the opt-out revolution. It is, I think, a mistake to completely dismiss the narrative of choice that the women of the opt-out revolution used to describe their lives. So rather than simply highlighting the extent that choice is constrained by market and familial norms and practices and structures, I take the rhetoric of choice seriously by focusing on its significance and discursive power in some newly emerging narratives of motherhood. And this is where I begin to turn to the second layer of my story. I think that the opt-out revolution can usefully be understood in the register of self-governance. Now, admittedly, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and I'm really into self-governance, so I can see it everywhere. But I really can see it here. By this, I mean, by self-governance, I'm referring to a mode of governance in which individuals are called upon to govern themselves through the choices that they make. It begins with a Foucauldian lens of governmentality, which explores governance through the conduct of self-conduct, or what he referred to in his later works as the technologies of the self. Other scholars, like Nicholas Rose, have looked at how contemporary regimes of subjectification increasingly rely on this kind of self-governance and the government of oneself. It's an approach to governance that very much presupposes the freedom of the governed to make choices, and then it seeks to shape the conduct of individuals by acknowledging and using this capacity for choice. So Rose argues, and I have a quote here, individuals are incited to live as if making a project of themselves. They are to work on their emotional world, their domestic and conjugal arrangements, their relations with employment, their techniques of sexual pleasure, to develop a style of living that will maximize the worth of their existence to themselves. I often parallel this quote from Nick Rose with Dr. Phil, who says you really need to make a project of yourself all the time. And it really goes from one to the other. So the opt-out revolution is, I think, part of these emerging projects of self-governance. Individual women here, admittedly, very privileged women, a small set of very privileged women, are being called upon to take responsibility for their lives and their families for individually balancing the competing demands of work and family by choosing one over the other, sequencing as it's now called. First you have a career, and then you have a family, and then we don't actually know what happens next. To be written. It's the very existence of choices in relation to the work-family conflict that are to be managed, negotiated, balanced, that produces motherhood as a project of self-governance and reconstitutes the identities of these women as mothers through their chosen child-rearing projects. And I think it's significant here that choice is not merely illusory. It's a new terrain on which these narratives of motherhood are being constituted. And the rhetoric of choice absolutely may be operating to obscure a range of structural obstacles or structural norms that continue to govern people's lives and women's lives. But it doesn't mean that for some, that the choice is not real. The women of the opt-out revolution, the upper-class, Ivy League educated, professional women, lawyers, doctors, MBAs, capable of commanding and leaving 6 and 7 figure salaries, are women with some choices, right? These are women who have a few choices. And it's crucial to the opt-out revolution narrative that their choices are not entirely fantastical. They chose their professions. They're now choosing to leave them, temporarily at least, because of the backing of a very wealthy husband, who presumably they also chose. They could have made other choices. They could hire nannies or 2 nannies. This is a news story that I hear from our sort of Wall Street equivalent, which is the only way for women to survive now is 2 nannies. You need 2 nannies. So you could hire 2 nannies and continue the high-pressure jobs like but they choose not to, right? They choose not to. They choose full-time motherhood. And it's reminiscent, for me, everything is, of an episode of Sex and the City. Charlotte has just quit her job, and she's being razzed by her friends. And she just insists over and over again, I choose my choice, I choose my choice. And these women are really choosing their choice. It's the fact that they have choices that makes their choice significant. And I think it would be much less interesting if they didn't really have choices. If they were all just being pushed out, that would be, I think, a less interesting story. And the women of the opt-out revolution, over and over again, discuss their choices in the language of managing themselves and managing their families. They all of them express a process of intense self-scrutiny and then of coming to the conclusion that this is just the right thing for them and their families. It's also often expressed in the language of responsibilization, of they are taking responsibility for their families, they're taking responsibility for their children. It's really important that they be there for their children, so they're stepping up to take responsibility. Now, my project on the opt-out revolution then goes on to look at different kinds of work that I think is being done by this language of choice and how it does operate to deflect attention and responsibility away from a whole range of broader regulatory structures, institutions, norms, and practices that shape the choices and that shape the consequences of the choices that these women are making. And so what disappears in this is any discussion of, the idea that there could be any state responsibility, God forbid, any broader market responsibility, any notion of employer responsibility. And in a truly extraordinary move in this language is the husband disappears. I mean, even the family disappears, right? This is just the individual woman's choice. Which I fear is going to actually come back to haunt the women because it will turn out in the end, because they're relying on the husbands being there for some time, which is at times a precarious choice to make. And so then when the husband isn't there and when he leaves, and when she seeks property and support and so on, the choice is going to come right back to bite her. It's like, what was your choice? It wasn't mine, honey. You left. You left the workforce. So there is this extraordinary way where even the husband disappears. Now, this project then fits into my more general project obsession, some might say, with looking at the family as a site of self-governance and exploring the role that law plays in shaping this self-governance, in producing the norms and practices of family life against which individuals govern themselves. And here I come, I guess, to the third layer of my story, which begins then with the question of, so what does any of this have to do with family law exactly? And family law as traditionally understood, right, if we understand it from the family law textbook, right, what's in the textbook, It's marriage and divorce and its consequences, property, alimony, custody, access, with a little twist of child protection and maybe a tweak of adoption thrown in. And that's really, the sort of mainstream of family law. Now, I suppose it's possible to squeeze a little part of the opt-out revolution into this discipline of family law.
10.
Thanks. So women's economic dependency on their husbands, assuming that the husbands will stay, what happens if they don't stay, will family law protect them, will it not protect them, how much of the choices that women are making are now being made in the shadow of their understanding of how family law will protect them. So there's a way in which we can find a little piece of traditional family law in this. Yet I also feel like in some ways that's really distorting the phenomenon. Because these women are making choices about the family, they're making choices about work, against a backdrop of norms and practices, deeply gendered, in each of these spheres. And so the opt-out revolution, like most work-family issues, tells us, I think, or begins to help us get at something about the very false or arbitrary or porous disciplinary borders of family law. Because the opt-out revolution, it seems to me, is located at a kind of intersection of family law and employment law. Family norms and employment norms, not fitting particularly neatly into either one. In that respect, I think it sort of fits quite neatly with Melissa's paper, who's talking about a different kind of intersection between family and criminal law. And this is then brings me to the idea of family law exceptionalism that Janet Halley and I and others have been playing with recently. And the idea of family law exceptionalism, I guess, starts with the idea that the family and family law have typically been seen as distinct and autonomous modes of life and regulation. It's both a descriptive claim, the family just is different, it just is. Family law just is different, it's a different kind of law, and a normative claim, it ought to be different. And the reasons for the claim are multiple. We can recite all kinds of them. The family is private, it's intimate, it's emotional, it's the site of parenting, it's the site of emotional vulnerability, it's the site of economic dependence, tradition, culture, the list goes on. There's a whole range of arguments that are typically marshaled to make these both descriptive and normative claims about just how different and special the family is. And so what we've tried to do in this conversation about family law exceptionalism is to explore and explode these claims, not by arguing that the family isn't different. So we're not, against the family is different. Although actually Janet and I may take different positions at different times on that, just for fun. But it isn't a claim to be against the idea that the family is different, but rather asking a very different set of questions, which is, how does family law exceptionalism work? Meaning, what kind of work does it do? What kind of discursive work does it do? What questions do and don't get asked when we accept that the family and family law are distinctive modes of social and regulatory life? So what does seeing it as different render not possible to see? What does it obscure? What might we be able to see if we begin to question those assumptions? And while the kind of work that many folks have been doing now in our sort of ongoing conversations under the sign of family law exceptionalism is multiple, and it's all over the place. One of the methods that seems to have emerged amongst those of us having this conversation is to try to track the ways in which the family is regulated beyond family law. So, for example, how do non-family laws directly regulate the family? Tax law, bankruptcy law, immigration law, like Kathy Abrams talked about this morning. How do these non-family law areas specifically recognize or regulate the family? How do non-family laws indirectly regulate the family? So a whole range of background rules that don't say anything particular about the family. They don't say anything particular about marriage. But in what way do background rules of contract and tort and municipal zoning ultimately regulate and affect the way that people live in families? And then one additional layer, and it's the one that I'm most interested in, is how might a range of informal norms, customs, and practices also regulate and affect the way people live in families? So the kind of self-governance question. So I think here it's an attempt to explode the disciplinary boundaries of family law in a way that ultimately reflects the kind of scholarship that many of us have been doing for years, but without really calling into question the boundaries of family law. And it's a conversation that just really quite remarkably parallels the conversation going on here around the disciplinary boundaries of family law, the idea of these new frontiers of family law. What might we find out when we push beyond, when we try to see family law outside of its more traditional boundaries? And I think that my project on the opt-out revolution, and more generally my work on the family as a site of self-governance, is very much located within this effort to break down the disciplinary boundaries of family law. And not only in terms of bridging, say, here in the opt-out revolution, trying to see the connections between and the interconnections between family and employment law and norms, but also embracing self-governance by making both an analytic and a normative claim that the practices of self-governance within the family should be part of the terrain of a new reconfigured family law. I'm almost done. And so I'll just end on sort of one final note about sort of having made a claim about this new terrain about kind of reconfigured family law, which is a note about what to call it. So when we call it family law exceptionalism, or when we try to make claims about family law, the new frontiers of family law, we've received more than a few raised eyebrows, suggesting that it is a rather imperial claim on the part of family law scholars to claim virtually every other area of law as theirs, and to rename the entire curriculum as family law. It's bold, it's different, it gets us out of the pink ghetto that family law has been in, but it's a bit hegemonic. And so, I feel a need maybe to suggest that we might want to call it something like the legal regulation of the family, as opposed to really, imperially claiming all of it as family law. Family law, take from Médecins Sans Frontières, it's, family law sans frontières. But it needn't be the last family law panel ever. It may just have to be called a little bit different.